Okay, good morning. It's really great to see everybody. So I am talking about the Parenting Begins Before Birth, the new science of prenatal programming and early brain behavior development. I want to start with this photo. In many societies, this is what Sunday morning is supposed to look like. So really appreciate everyone coming here on a Sunday morning for having this engaged session, as I really look forward to discussion, and I know you've been having a really rigorous, engaged time already. And to say that this is Sunday morning, having lost an hour, so really thanks. I'm pleased to be here, and thank you for everyone for showing up. All right, so we are not going to forget about the baby while we take care of the mother. This is from Dr. Kumar, who was one of the first. He was a psychiatrist based in the UK, and really thinking about maternal mental health, which has become perinatal mental health. And obviously here in this quote, really taking a dyadic perspective. We need to be thinking about the baby while we're thinking about the mother. One theme I want to have in this talk today is that they really are so intimately connected, as well as is the partner. How the new generation is doing affects the parents, and how the parents are doing affect the child. And I just want to make a disclaimer before I start. I am going to sometimes use the term women, and then I'll sometimes say birthing person. And for me, it's important to keep the term woman, in part because of I think another conversation, but the history of feminism and how women have been defined by their reproductive capacities, sometimes in very restrictive ways. So I like to keep the term women, but also want to be respectful that there are people who give birth who don't identify as women. So please know I'm thinking inclusively, even if I sometimes use the term women. All right, so this dyadic perspective, both generations at the same time. I'm going to shift the time frame back and go to developmental origins of health and disease, which is often called DOHAD, aka prenatal programming, as you've already heard about. And a tagline for this, as you can see from this Time magazine article, which is from back in 2010, how the first 9 months shape the rest of your life. Now, has anybody heard of prenatal programming or DOHAD before? One, a little bit. Two. Okay, I'm actually, that's great. I have earned my keep in being here. So hopefully we'll introduce you to some new ideas and some new research. So another way to describe this DOHAD model, this prenatal programming, is to think of the womb as an influential first home. And this is from David Barker, who really, he also was from the UK and really launched this field, this DOHAD model. I want to give you a nugget of the conceptual model that is from Barker and really informs the kind of research that I've been doing in many other labs. And I'm just going to read through this with you. Recent findings suggest that many human fetuses have to adapt to limited supply of nutrients, and in doing so, they permanently change their physiology and metabolism. These programmed changes, bless you, may be the origins of a number of diseases in later life, including coronary heart disease and the related disorders of stroke, diabetes, and hypertension. So this is also sometimes the phrase, and I'm going to come back to this in the talk, of experiences get under the skin. That stress gets under the skin to affect biology and well-being. And here, it's the experiences of the mother getting under the skin of the fetus, because the woman's experiences, the pregnant person's experiences, happen on multiple levels, and subjectively, phenomenologically, but also in biology. And the birthing person's biology is that fetus's home. So these are a little bit out of order in my up here, so you're getting the last bullets first. So hold on, let's go through the first one. So there's a way now to think about DOHAD with an evolutionary perspective. So, as I've said, but I want to amplify this, prenatal maternal experiences are exposures for the next generation, and they may function to forecast the postnatal environment. So then the fetus responds with adaptations, and then the purpose is to improve fitness to a later stage in development. So then the health outcomes may result in part from the match between the prenatal and the postnatal environments. So Barker, if you recall the conceptual model paragraph I just read from him, he was working in the area of inadequate nutrition. And he actually based a lot of his work on a pretty gross measure of inadequate nutrition in pregnancy, and that was on lower birth weight as the baby was born. And he said that must reflect poor nutrition. But what happens if there's poor nutrition, and that's that inadequate nutrition for the fetus and its environment, but then the baby and the child grows up when there's postnatally plenty of food, or potentially plenty of high carbohydrate, high caloric food with low nutrition. What happens is in utero, the thrifty genes get turned on. I'm in an environment, and maybe this is going to be my future, where there is not enough food. So I'm turning on what colloquially gets called thrifty genes to store fat better, to store calories better, so that if I'm not finding enough food, I'm going to make use of what I have. But in his theory and in his epidemiologic research, and now has been shown in a lot of animal models where you can control the exposure of the nutrition in the postnatal life, if there's a mismatch between in utero and the thrifty genes getting turned on, but then there's all sorts of Dunkin' Donuts, if you know that from being in the United States, or McDonald's, you're getting tons of calories in you, and you're very efficient in how you use them, and they get stored as adiposity, as fat. And that contributes over the life course to these metabolic syndromes that are then related to cardiovascular disease. So keeping in mind this idea of adaptation, I actually want to share with you, it is an animal study, slightly different outcome, but it really exemplifies this idea of prenatal programming with an evolutionary perspective being adaptation. So this is, as you can see, the title, Density Triggers Maternal Hormones and Increase Adaptive Offspring Growth in a Wild Mammal. So this is a study of squirrels. There were 3 different groups of squirrels in this experimental study. One group was just typical, the control group. And then one group was exposed, these are pregnant squirrels, to auditory stimuli in the environment of other squirrels. So indicating you live in a very densely populated area. And then the third group of squirrels got that auditory sound during pregnancy, and they also had access to added food, so they were eating more and more during pregnancy. The 2 experimental groups, when their offspring were born, charting their growth, how much they grew postnatally, and on the x-axis what you're seeing is by litter size, which influences how you grow in the future. The 2 experimental groups grew faster compared to the control groups. So even just hearing density cues while pregnant altered the maternal biology, and it was shown to be done through the stress hormone cortisol, to trigger different gene activations and growth postnatally to be bigger, all the better to fight for food in a densely populated environment. So this really illustrates the Doe-Head model, adding that perspective of evolutionary adaptation for survival. Okay, so shifting gears, many of us then wondered about mental health in the mother, not just her nutrition, or focusing on mental health, possibly also in the context of inadequate nutrition at times, but focusing on mental health as being an exposure for the fetus, and then wondering about neurodevelopment in utero that would then be identified as possibly adaptations postnatally in babies and in older children that may ultimately, between the pre and the postnatal environment, may end up as mismatches for that child and put them at risk for their own neurodevelopment, their own mental health problems. And one thing I want to point out as I go into this research is I'm emphasizing the adaptation part of this model, but you'll see a lot of titles in research, including some from our lab at times, that emphasize what could be called a teratogenic approach. How could mental health it's debilitating often for people, so for a pregnant person, and that's a bad thing, like a teratogenic. And then the offspring's development is going to be negatively impacted, of course. So the emphasis becomes on a bad exposure and a bad outcome. But trying to keep in mind what Barker emphasized is that the fetus is making adaptations for survival, I think opens up our way of thinking about this research and also thinking about kinds of intervention. It works against narrowing the lens. All right, so here's a paper that came out several years ago, and I'm going to walk you through the main finding: the persisting effect of maternal mood in pregnancy on child psychopathology. So what you're seeing here, and this is a sample of nearly 8,000, this is also out of the UK, there's a theme here, and what it's showing is that women with higher anxiety during pregnancy, their children have twice the risk of mental health disorders at all those different age points on the x-axis as you're seeing there. And those are the kids who were in mothers with high anxiety there in the white bars. So particularly these psychopathology outcomes were anxiety and ADHD. So this is really a take-home message here. There are thousands of papers out here supporting this kind of association. And it's supportive of the prenatal programming. Something about being anxious, highly anxious in pregnancy is also happening on the biological level on the mother. That's a different environment for the fetus, and that alters brain development to put the child at risk for anxiety and ADHD. This is a great study. There's one confound. It was based on maternal report of the child outcomes. So anyone want to raise a hand? Why would that be a concern? If you have mom reporting on her anxiety in pregnancy and then she's rating her child through the child's development. Yes, please. Guilt? Guilt. That's really interesting. Yeah, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm looking at this and thinking that I was anxious in pregnancy. So I might underreport. Because I feel that it's my fault.
Great. Okay, so you might underreport because you're carrying a guilt and you don't want to see any problems, right? Absolutely. Other thoughts?
I would think anxious moms generally a little more worried about everything, maybe more worried about their children, might perceive that their child has some kind of pathology, some kind of anxiety, when maybe more relaxed moms might not observe that.
Okay, absolutely. So these are great, different hypotheses, different interpretations, but they both end up at the same place, right? A bias. Yeah, please.
Also, an anxious parent has just a more anxious home environment, and their children are just more anxious, maybe not because of biology, but just because it's stressful.
Great. Can everyone hear that? Oh, you want to say that one more time, Sue? Yeah.
I was just saying, couldn't also an anxious parent create a more stressful, anxious home environment? So everyone is just more anxious, maybe not because of biology, but because it's just stressful.
Beautiful. Now you've seen my slides coming up in the future, so you must have got ahead of them. But these are all great points, and I definitely will return to that. So yes, there's a bias from a research standpoint, and then thinking about your own reporting. If you have the same source for both the input and the output, you do wonder about bias. You want to find some external validation for these assessments. But again, fantastic work out of this group that really helped get the prenatal programming studies going. So we and many others have done papers where the outcome is observer-based. And so this is using what's called the NIH Toolbox. And what we found is that stress and depressive symptoms during pregnancy were related to lower levels of inhibitory control based on observer-based tests, and also less sustained attention, particularly in males. So less sustained attention, not as good at inhibiting, impulses. That certainly sounds like either, those are components, I should say, of ADHD or anxiety. So you certainly see how these findings from observer-based study is consistent with the maternal report of outcomes. So I really want to emphasize, if you use PubMed, which I imagine many of you do, there are just hundreds of thousands of papers supporting the prenatal programming model with maternal mental health issues as the exposure, putting the child at risk for psychopathology. Another challenge to this model, though, as you may have been thinking, is shared genes of risk. So is prenatal programming really just reflecting maternal risky genes for anxiety, depression, ADHD, and the child is just manifesting those? And what's really supportive of the contrasting interpretation is it's not just genes. And we have this from animal studies where there's a lot. We can have, of course, experimental control, because you can have animal models with the same genetic background and then sort them to have some of they're called dams when they're pregnant mice or rats. Some of the dams go through stress and some don't. So you've really isolated genes as the factor. And what we're seeing in the offspring whose mothers were stressed during pregnancy is enhanced neuroendocrine responses to challenge. So that's that stress hormone cortisol, amongst others. We see increased levels of anxiety and depressive-like behaviors, and they also have cognitive impairments. So very consistent with what many of the studies show in the human literature. And also, much more recently, people have used what's called the polygenic risk score, which is there's an identification of primary genes that are associated with risk for mental health conditions. And being able to control for those in these studies in the child and show that mother's anxiety is associated with child risk for mental health issues, even when you control for these genes of risk. So this came out just a couple months ago, and we wrote a commentary, as you can see, on these recent findings. So to the person's point before who got the microphone, one of the other challenges to this model is are we really looking at prenatal influences, or are we looking at postnatal ones? So is there an impact of maternal prenatal distress on child outcomes, or, as was very well pointed out, is that prenatal distress merely a marker for the postnatal environment, which is actually the agent of exerting the effect? So many of us have taken that challenge and said, okay, let's look closer to the pregnancy period to find influences on development of the child, so independent of postnatal influences. So to do this, we look at the fetus's autonomic nervous system development, which is very much involved in maintaining homeostasis, and things like heart rate and heart rate variability are part of our stress responses. So how much your heart rate reacts to a stressor. Having heart rate variability, that's the parasympathetic control of the heart. The heart is happiest when it dances. So you want to have high heart rate variability. That's associated with better physical health and also emotion regulation. So the parasympathetic control can release the brake on the heart rate to allow it to go up when it needs to, but also can put a brake on it quickly and nimbly when it needs to slow down. So you want that heart rate that dances. It can move around easily. We also look at something in the fetus, which is heart rate and movement coupling. When you go to the gym and you start to run on the treadmill, first what happens is your body is moving, and then your heart rate joins it to get more oxygen to your muscles. In the fetus, the somatic system, the body, and the heart rate are working together more closely over the course of gestation. So having higher correlation between heart rate and movement is an indication of more advanced central nervous system development. And then we also look at the brain, and there's some, actually I'm not showing it here, but some people also look at the fetal brain. So some work we did a long, long time ago, and I'm going to go through this quickly. We've replicated it many times. We've had women come into the lab, and we give them a stressor in the lab because we reasoned that if stress is affecting women as they're walking around in pregnancy and it's communicated and affecting the fetus, we should be able to take a movie of that in the lab and see stress affect the woman and affect the fetus in real time. And what I'm showing you here are fetal heart rate changes to maternal stress in our lab, parsed by whether the women had depression or anxiety or were highly anxious in pregnancy. And so the two bars, I think you can see my cursor? Yes. The two bars here, these are fetuses of depressed women and fetuses of highly anxious women. Not an anxiety disorder, but highly anxious. Those fetuses had high heart rate change when their mothers were under stress in the lab, and the other fetuses didn't. The mother's biology changed similarly across these groups. So what we're seeing by third trimester is fetuses of depressed women and highly anxious women were more reactive to a change in their environment. So if someone ran in the room right now very quickly, some of us would move slowly to look, others would react quickly. We had the same stimuli, but we have differences in how we're reacting. And then what we saw is that the fetuses who had that higher heart rate response, they reacted quickly to a change in their in utero environment, they went on to have more reactive temperament. And just to give a sense, this is also getting looked at by many other labs. And here, looking at depression during pregnancy and fetal heart rate variability. And remember, higher heart rate variability in a resting state is associated with better regulation of emotion. So what you're seeing here is that the capacity for the baby at 3 months to regulate is associated with the higher heart rate variability. So putting together that you can go from behavior to aspects of heart rate and heart rate variability with the exposure of how mothers are doing in pregnancy in relation to stress and anxiety, predicting those autonomic nervous system indices of development. So we also went out and looked at the brain, and this is in newborns. And what we saw, these are babies whose mothers were depressed compared to babies whose mothers were not depressed during pregnancy. And very quickly, we saw less connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex acts as that brake on the amygdala, which is very much involved in fear and emotion responses. So this is also a more reactive brain. And in a really fantastic study that just came out a couple years ago from WashU, this was looking at a task-based, babies are, 1-month-old babies are asleep, but they're exposed to oddball sounds. And what they found is that those babies whose mothers were highly anxious in pregnancy, they had more neuronal activity when they heard this oddball sound. And the areas of the brain that showed this greater neuronal response were things like the left and right anterior insula, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. These are areas that are very much implicated in anxiety disorders in adults. So how we put this together is prenatal maternal distress we're seeing is associated with greater reactivity in the offspring. From an evolutionary perspective, prenatal maternal distress exposure may forecast for that baby that it's an adverse, dangerous environment out there. Be prepared. And heightened reactivity may be adaptive in a dangerous environment. Be prepared for challenges to come. But the consequences for the child could be the match between how well the prenatal forecasting and the postnatal environment match. So if you're being primed in your reactivity, in your brain and your temperament and your autonomic nervous system, to be very reactive to stimuli because you're ready for a dangerous world. And yet you come into, I'll just say, United States environment, and you're in overcrowded classrooms, you're in overcrowded daycare even, and what is deemed as adaptive is to be quiet and non-reactive to stimuli. It's a bad match. And you can see this is a foundation for these disorders developing like ADHD and anxiety. You're very reactive, you're moving around, you can't focus because that's adaptive in a dangerous world, but you're supposed to be able to sit still and focus on only one thing, even if the classroom or the environment is very chaotic. I was just going to stop. Fabulous. Yes, please.
Thanks so much for this next question. A question that I have is, for example, birthing people with postpartum depression who may not have been anxious prenatally or may not have had psychopathology prenatally. Do you still see developmental changes, or so it's really functional something? Do you see developmental changes, and if so, how do those relate to the kinds of things you're seeing with prenatal psychopathology?
Right. So we've known for a long, long time that being raised by a person or people, frankly, also the partner who are experiencing depression or anxiety really influences the different qualities of the caregiving and has impact on bonding and attachment that can later play out in terms of cognitive difficulties. So the postnatal influence has been known for a long time. And I should have said in the prior work, that very large study, they always control for postnatal environments. They're really trying to isolate that prenatal. And I think some of the questions right now are, it's going to be different for different families where you have both exposures, say a prenatal depression and a postpartum depression affecting the child, or you have only that exposure in one. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Are we having problems?
No.
Oh, okay.
I guess we'll just open it up to the room.
Yeah, I have more slides. I know I'm kind of talking slowly, but I should say that sometimes when I show the data about the women coming into the lab, I say that the women who were highly anxious and their fetuses were reactive, that those are real New York women, and the women who were low key to the stress in the lab in terms of their self-report and their fetuses didn't show a reaction, those women were all transported from California, right? And they're just kind of, so I just want to identify myself as really a true New Yorker, and I'm going slowly because I was trying to get back here from Colorado, and I got off a plane that delayed my getting here, but they were going to ice the, because it was really snowing, they were going to ice the wings, and they needed to change the weight of the plane because they were icing the wings, and so they did that by getting people off the plane. This seemed very unscientific to me, so I thought, I'm not going to ride this plane, but which meant I got home at 1 a.m. last night. So I'm a little slow today. So please, questions, and we'll see if I get through all my slides. Yeah, I don't, oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this great presentation. So, as a mother of a 4-year-old who struggled with postpartum depression, but also had what I think was high levels of end of pregnancy stress, I'm thinking, oh my God, how did I mess up my child?
Yeah.
So, a couple questions for you. One is, are there periods of the prenatal period where maternal stress and maternal mental health is particularly, what are the developmental periods of or parts of the pregnancy where the fetus is most sensitive? And second, like, how much of this can be corrected after the child is born?
Okay, these are really excellent questions, and you did not do anything bad to your children. Don't, and that's actually one of my last slides, and I do really want to be sure to get to that. So many responses for you. One is that the effects I'm showing you from a research perspective, of course, are just on average, and they're relatively small effects. And but to me, it's still very important to emphasize that for policy reasons, to advocate for mental health services, et cetera. It's also one reason I emphasize adaptation. This is a period, prenatal up to age 3, still ongoing, phenomenal brain plasticity. So there's so much opportunity for other exposures to help with adaptation. But I really want to emphasize, that's one reason I want to emphasize adaptation. These are not teratogens. They're not some sort of huge sledgehammer dramatically affecting the brain in ways that are not going to be open to other influences that are fostering adaptation in the postnatal environment. And then your question about timing is such a good one, and I have to say honestly still somewhat of frustration, because we know a lot about how the brain develops prenatally, but the research to date is rather scattered. Is it second? Is it third trimester? So we really need to get to a point where we can say more about exposures at what point and what kind of exposures. But certainly earlier on, the more, if you will, primary limbic areas, or in fact that sensory areas are developing sooner, but doesn't mean that babies come out with hearing problems, but it may be that there are subtle shifts, say in somatosensory experiences, that then get overlaid in terms of how they're interacting with the environment. So it comes out in higher order brain areas. So a lot to unpack.
Hi, I think I've got the other mic. It's
There
me.
you are, thank you.
Hi. So, a lot of women of childbearing age, we know, I think it's like 1 in 5, 1 in 4 women in the US of childbearing age take an antidepressant, some kind of SSRI or other medication. What is the indication of this information about whether those women should stay on an antidepressant throughout their pregnancy or go off of that medication because there's also effects of, or potential effects of the medication itself? It seems like that's a conversation that comes up in a doctor's office pretty frequently.
So, yes. So first of all, our healthcare system is not set up in any way so that people actually get the best mental health care. And that's an understatement. And the best mental health care is mild to moderate depression is you actually start with psychotherapy. But it's a lot easier to access an SSRI through your obstetrician who's making a judgment that you have depression, and then you're put on a medication. So that's the first thing to say. So there's an inordinate number of people in general, in my view, who are taking medication and not getting other access to helping their mental health. The data on SSRI affecting the future baby's brain, when you look specifically and use MRI or you do some animal models, you can find these subtle effects of SSRIs. But the excellent, largely out of Harvard, epidemiologic studies show no effect on child development, and certainly no effect that could be separated from the huge confound, which is that it also can be that those who are on medication versus those who aren't have a more severe depression, and that could be influencing the child. So in terms of the risk-benefit ratio, one thing that frustrates me is I don't think these kind of data, this kind of research should be used by practitioners to encourage a pregnant person to take medication, because it's not really a randomized control trial. We're not really saying, we're not really making that comparison. Instead, I think the approach, first of all, is to do a total overhaul of our mental health system, which is not going to happen, but we're fighting. But is to use the oxygen mask analogy, which is for your baby to be doing well, you need to do well. And if you've been on a medication that works, stay on it. And if you're really struggling in pregnancy and there isn't an option for therapy or therapy isn't working, then do a medication. Who has the power with the mic?
Do you want to continue your slides?
Could I do a few more? And is that okay? Can people hold their questions? Is that, please? Okay, please do, because I'm really pleased to have the questions. So I just want to highlight that in looking at prenatal programming, there's a lot of work now trying to identify the biological mechanisms. And this is a paper we did several years ago. But looking at, and a new area for me of interest is changes in mitochondria related to functioning related to maternal stress and pregnancy. But certainly looking at epigenetic effects, looking at hormones, gut microbiome, a lot of different pathways. I just wanted to give you, and then I wanted to say that can add rigor to our results, which still are really based on association. So if we can get a biological mechanism, we're feeling more confident about our findings of prenatal programming. It's possible that getting at mechanisms could lead us to a biological target one day. I wanted to give you a sense, I'll go through this quickly, of some work that we did on mechanisms looking at placenta gene regulation. And so on the y-axis, you're seeing perceived stress, and on the x-axis, you're seeing changes in methylation of 11-beta HSD2, which is a gene highly expressed in the placenta. That's when it's on, it in essence deactivates cortisol as it goes into the fetal compartment. And what you're seeing here is that women who endorse low levels of stress have low methylation of that gene in the placenta, so the cortisol that goes into the fetal compartment is deactivated. But if the converse is true, if you have high stress, there's high methylation of that gene, and then more cortisol is getting into the fetal compartment. And so then what we see in the next graph image on the right is that coupling, that index of heart rate and movement being coordinated in the fetus, telling us about central nervous system development. So that what you're seeing on the right-hand bar there, but in this first, right-hand graph, but in this first bar, that the lower the methylation, so again, cortisol is deactivated from the maternal side, the higher the coupling. But when that gene is not able to function, there's high methylation, there's lower coupling, so an index of less development in the central nervous system as it controls autonomic and somatic systems. There's another paper, just to give you a sense of the kind of work that's out there on mechanisms. This is from Greg Miller's group, looking at disadvantage, in terms of experiencing poverty, being related to inflammation in the mother, and then looking at neonatal white microstructure, so in the brain. So finding that those who were in the very low socioeconomic status, so very, very poor, the pregnant person had higher levels of IL-6, an immune marker, and then lower neonatal axal diffusity in the uncinate. And the uncinate is tracts in the brain that are connecting areas supporting emotion regulation. So this diffusity indicates that there's less coherent orientation of the axons. So we want a lot of coherence in order for that tract to work well to support emotion regulation. So you get much further in terms of, I think, the connecting the dots in a way where the results are very rigorous. We've moved away from mere associations, and we're looking at a biological mechanism by which maternal experience is affecting baby brain development. So new things on the horizon, and this goes back to what I said about stress getting under the skin. We use the allostatic load model from Bruce McEwen to look at indications of stress in the mind and body. And you can see on the top of the graph, we looked at BMI and diet and cortisol and mental health. We put this all into a statistical model with pregnant women, and we ended up with 3 groups. As you can see, the healthy group is in purple. These are all on a standardized Z-scores. There's physically stressed in yellow, and you can see they're higher on BMI and blood pressure, and then the psychologically stressed group in red. Now, these are all women having healthy pregnancies by their OBs. But then when you look at the preterm birth rate, you can see the physically stressed group had twice the rate of the US national average. The psychologically stressed had about the national average of our preterm birth rate, and the healthy group has half the rate of preterm birth. So I really take from this, what can we do to deal with people's stress as it's expressed in mind and body to reduce the preterm birth rate. Preterm birth is the biggest killer of babies. I should say it in a more professional way, associated with infant mortality. It's also a risk factor for ADHD. We're also on this other graph see that those women grouped in these different stress groups, you can see their babies, their fetuses also differed in that coupling index, with the physically stressed having lower levels of that coupling index. I want to point out, if you go back here on this graph, this is social support. When we did some statistical analyses, this is the variable by which the groups differed most with social support. I did not expect that. I thought it would just be stress ratings. This really says that social support is a potentially very malleable factor, and that we could really, through different kinds of interventions and support, get in there to enhance the experience of support in pregnancy. for women and their future children. We've also been doing work led by Marissa Spann, looking at discrimination and acculturation during pregnancy on the baby brain. So that's a paper that just came out. People are leveraging intervention studies, again, to try to get more experimental control. So this is out of Alicia Davis's group. So using an established intervention to treat depression in the pregnancy period, and not just looking, did it work on depression in the mother, but what about baby's brain and behavior development? This is a randomized control trial. So if we remove what we think is an exposure leading to adaptations that are not ultimately helpful for the child's adjustment and development postnatally, if we remove that exposure of depression by treating it, do we see that the babies look like more like babies of healthy control? So this is a way to get some experimental control and really support this prenatal programming model. I think it's very exciting work. Also on the horizon, and I shared earlier with someone that maybe in my next life, because certainly my first career choice was to be a journalist, so I really applaud the work you all are doing. And so you should know about these two studies that are currently ongoing in the US with just huge sample size. Healthy Brain and Child Development is almost 8,000 pregnant women being followed with their baby. Supposed to have actually 50,000, but not every child followed from pregnancy. And they're going to have observer-based outcomes, as we've been talking about, biological data, including MRI and DNA. I think also on the horizons to continue to probe this prenatal programming model is using assisted reproductive technology to put to the side shared genes. So I'm highlighting here, you can see we had one participant in this study I already described to you in the red dot. That was a donor egg pregnancy. So no shared genes between the mother and the fetus. And yet, the outcomes are consistent with the prenatal programming model. So she told us she was not at all anxious, and on the PSS, on the anxiety scale, and in fact there was low methylation in her placenta. The placenta actually comes from the fetus. And then that fetus also had high coupling consistent with the mother being low anxious, and they didn't share genes at all. So this is something we're really wanting to pursue, as are other groups, to separate the gene environment, the shared genes, from the prenatal programming influences. And so we can look at gestational carriers, we can look at donor egg pregnancies, and this is a collaboration we're beginning to work on. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. Sex effects and bidirectional influences. This is from Samira Aboueish, who was in my lab for a year from Saudi Arabia. And she looked at heart rate variability and in women who had very high BMI. So remember, BMI was one of those indicators of being physically stressed in pregnancy. She saw female fetuses of high BMI women had significantly lower heart rate variability, as you can see in the red there. It was true for females, but not males. And this was in a resting baseline, and then also during that stressor period that the mothers went through. But then what she saw in the mothers is that high BMI women carrying females had significantly higher heart rate, more reactive, and lower heart rate variability. And you can see that in the red here as well. So interesting to think about the sex of the fetus brings in biology to the mother that could then feed back to the mother, which is why this is a dyad. Mother, parent, partner affect the baby. The baby also, this is true postnatally, but we're learning more, it's true prenatally, may affect the mother. All right, practical implications. When we think about prenatal programming, we really need to be careful in no way to blame the mothers. One of the primary, there's so many reasons for that. We would never want to do that, blame the gestational, the pregnant person. To be clinically useful or helpful to someone, there's no blame anywhere. And also because the stressors in particularly in the US society, are not equally distributed with our incredible wealth disparity, our systemic racism. So we would never hold someone responsible for the conditions that are based on economic, social circumstances. So we need to be careful, no blame. It's why I always emphasize when we're looking at research, it's on average, and these are small effect sizes. But I think we can take from this, maternal mental health matters for 2 generations. Parenting does begin before birth. How you're doing, how your partner is doing, because your partner is going to affect you, you affect your partner. It's a system. Parenting begins before birth because you're affecting the child. Brain development begins before birth. We can transform the perinatal care ecosystem to really have public health impact. And this is, this is something we're actively working on. I, along with some leading obstetricians and other policy experts, wrote this paper, and this is currently very much a focus for us, is we want to address things like the inequities, so make things more equitable in perinatal care, what birth experiences are like, parent preparedness, mental health, to really support families from the start. So we're working on birth preferences, Zoom-based postpartum drop-in groups, having a website clearinghouse for the different kinds of programs that are out there so they can be replicated in Milwaukee and Oregon. And really, we have a mental health service that's embedded in our obstetrics department, wanting to show how that can be replicated. So this is very much a focus for us. And that's my last slide, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have 10 minutes for questions. So fire away. Who wants to start? I'm going to go here first.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Lara from Barcelona. Sorry for my English. I'll try to do my best. I was wondering at how a traumatic birth can affect to the brain development of the child. I'm thinking in obstetric violence. It's an expression we use in Europe. I don't know if you use it here. Even doctors don't like too much. So yeah, which effect could it have?
So I think I got part of that, and I'm sorry if I'm being slow. So a traumatic birth, meaning something like the physical experience of labor and delivery. Yeah. There's forceps, there's an emergency C-section.
Yeah, separation.
Separation.
For example.
Yeah, I mean, that's, it's not been a focus for me, but it is certainly getting studied more. I mean, for me, that's after pregnancy, and I've been so focused on what goes on during the pregnancy period. But certainly that has huge impact on the birthing person's well-being, and that can very much impact their adjustment to parenting, and can therefore influence their sensitivity, their availability for the baby, and then really how that dyad begins to form a relationship. So for sure can have an impact. I've become increasingly interested in when there's past trauma, and this is, of course, people wanting to bring trauma-informed care into obstetric care. When there's past trauma, how much gets activated even when it's a particularly easy labor and delivery, because of all that goes on around body exposure, lack of control. I worked with a patient recently who had been molested as a teenager. And so she wanted me to be part of the conversation with her obstetrician to talk about how she wanted to keep her gown on, that she'd bought a special gown. So when there's past trauma, having different providers be aware, so that however the birth goes, the past trauma is not activated in the worst way. It's still likely to get activated just because of chaos, fear, not feeling in control of your body. So I hope I answered your question. Great. Okay.
This is Ritu Chatterjee again from NPR. So you mentioned you showed one study where you're looking at discrimination.
Yeah.
Yesterday we heard from one of the speakers about how Black infant mortality is twice as high as like white infant mortality, and it's something that I've reported on in the past. And when I did that story in 2018, I'd reported on these set of beautiful studies done a few years ago by a couple neonatologists that showed that when immigrant women from Africa came and gave birth here, their babies were, within normal, like rate of preterm birth, low birth weight babies were like not that bad, like they're normal weight babies, but then their daughters had low birth weight babies. Like that's considered one of the best evidences for like the experience of growing up here as a Black woman influences that. Are we any in either your research or anybody else doing this research, are we any closer to understanding sort of the epigenetic basis of that?
So, yeah, I mean, it's just so troubling to hear this, right? But it really speaks to the life course perspective we need to have on health. I mean, it does start prenatally, I think, and maybe even preconception, but we carry our experiences in our bodies and our brains over the life course. So, to be an immigrant here is to experience so many adversities and unfairness that gets under the skin and affects health. I mean, that's really sad to hear how that can get, I mean, I hate being reminded of this. It's data I know very well. I would say that epigenetics is going to be one of the possible mechanisms. We have a grant right now trying to understand the disparities in the preterm birth rate, which is about 14% in Black women and about 8% in white women. And so wanting to both identify the phenomenological experiences for the person of discrimination and what kind of stressors that means for them, but look at some of the biology. And as I sort of indicated before, we're looking at mitochondria functioning, and we're also looking at activation of immune systems. So I think we're not closer, but to saying specifically what is happening. There are probably a lot of different biological adaptations, frankly, happening that then amount to the poor birth outcomes.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to help you help us unpack the idea of social support that you underlined is so important. And in being in the mental health world, one of the things I'm aware of is working with a mother, let's say particularly, or caregiver, who has a trauma history or even just had a difficult childhood. We have a concept of ghosts in the nursery, which is that you're bringing with you what happened to you in your childhood that you may not even have processed that much. Another piece of work going on right now is BCEs, or beneficial early childhood experiences. You guys heard about adverse childhood experiences, but there's a whole bunch of people that Catherine knows and is working with that are focusing on what is the impact as a mother when you're pregnant of thinking of what somebody was for you in your life, a caregiver that really cared about you or experiences that you had. So I'm just wondering if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. So to touch on the latter, there's this very influential work by Selma Freiberg about ghosts in the nurseries. And I think that's a huge part of becoming a parent. And in one of our interventions to prevent postpartum depression, that's a component of it, is reflecting on how you were parented and what kind of aspects of that parenting in childhood were painful and what you want to keep with you. So really trying to support that process. So there is this, to have a contrast to the ghosts in the nurseries, there's now a concept of angels in the nursery. So who's a representation of a positive attachment relationship where you felt loved and held in high regard by someone, and to activate those templates of relationships. So I think social support, and in the data we had here, has both the emotional connections, and sometimes you have to, if you will, clear out the cobwebs of some of the very negative experiences of attachment in order to activate those more positive ones. And it's important to do that in the pregnancy time in order to get to social support with other people, in order that you can trust other people to help you in that time, whether it's a friend, someone in your religious group, or a professional. Another part of social support, though, that's really important and was in the data also is just the instrumental support. Do you have anybody to come by and hold the baby for a while so you can nap? So that's part of social relations, but it's a different way of being with people, and I think that's a really key part of social support also.
Hi. I was thinking about women who have some fertility problem, and I think it's very stressful to be under treatment and trying to get pregnant. And this stress, can this stress have these bad influences for the baby, like even before the pregnancy?
Yes. Okay, so well, first of all, I do want to move away from sort of, I'm very interested that effects on the child begin before birth, but I want to be cautious about sort of those bad influences, right? Because remember, they're very small factors influencing that child's development. So I'm going to reframe your question as, can the stress, which can be quite significant during infertility treatment, so before the baby's born, have any influence on that future child? And yes, in ways we don't yet understand, but preconception biology is really interesting. Just the way childhood trauma gets under the skin and it is carried forward in life and does affect gestational biology, so could something, closer to conceiving, theoretically. And I'm really interested in studying that. It's very hard to study in the US. 50% of births are unplanned. But I actually just came back from a trip to see Samira Abu-Aish in Saudi Arabia, where it's very different statistics. Most people, 80-90%, because of religious and cultural practices, go to preconception counseling. So there's really an opportunity to learn about stress preconception and see how it may affect the future child. I work a lot with people undergoing fertility treatment, and it's highly stressful. We offer support groups and do individual counseling, which I think really can help.
Hi, I'm Gabriella. I'm a freelance journalist, and I wondered if in any of your studies you'd looked at twins and if there was any difference in the results.
Yeah, we would love to look at twins, but we can't, since most of my work, or a lot of my work has been in the prenatal period, and as I said, there's a colleague downtown at NYU, Mariah Thomason, who does fetal imaging, which I also is the future. The problem is we can't easily tag the twins. So if if I study one on one day, and I don't know if they've switched positions, I can't put a big marker on them to say you're baby A and you're baby B. So we've not really refined that yet. And also, to be frank, it's hard to say for heart rate. I don't have it's from a research perspective, separating out which heart rate is which baby can be hard. Yeah.
Hi. I want to know if there are some studies about how the stress for the pregnant person, when the person is raped, how this stress and becomes pregnant since then, how does this affect the development of the fetus, of the child? I'm asking this, I don't know if we got this kind of studies here, because in my country, which is Brazil, abortion is forbidden, but when a person is raped, the person has the right to do it so, but there are so many difficulties and judgment, so I would like to know more about it.
It's a great question, and as you know, in the US, we are much more in an anti-choice environment, particularly for some people in some states. So this is, unfortunately, a very relevant question. I wish it weren't, but there are either from the traumatic experience of rape or from becoming pregnant but not wanting to, there are many people carrying babies and they don't want to. And we haven't yet studied that. But unfortunately, I think the U.S. is going to give us an opportunity to do so. And I think one of the big questions is, how can we counsel people so that for them and the future child, like what kind of interventions do we need that are really developed for these kinds of situations to try to mitigate some of that stress for them and the future child, because they're particular situations. And again, I think about someone who experienced trauma as a child, or the violation and lack of control, and even if the pregnancy is not through a rape, it's through consensual sex, but they don't want the baby. They don't want to be a mother at this time, or maybe ever. And systems are telling them, no, you don't have control of your body. I think that's going to be very activating, particularly for someone who lost control of their body and their integrity through abuse as a child. So really important questions.
Are there any other questions from the public? Okay, got one more. This is going to be the last one.
I'll try to make it really good then. We had panelists yesterday that were talking about the links between poverty and negative outcomes for children. And I'm always worried about framing that as poor people can't be good parents. And so I want to understand the mechanisms between, like, what is it about poverty
Yes.
that leads to negative outcomes? Is this a piece of the puzzle, do you think? And like, what is it about poverty that leads to poor prenatal conditions?
I totally agree with you, and I should try to be quicker on this and succinct the way you were. Poverty is a very generic exposure. It's got that big word "bad" on it. But what is it about experiencing poverty? Is it the demoralization? Is it the lack of control? Is it the hopelessness? Is it not having enough food? What are the different parts of it that then can map onto different biology that then affect the fetus? And I think you can do the same thing, postnatally. So unpacking from a psychological and biological perspective in the parent what then is communicated to the child, either prenatally or postnatally, is important, very important from a research perspective, and maybe from an intervention perspective. I sometimes want to do therapy with my patients that actually, and this is starting to come up around the environment, that in part motivates them politically, because then you have agency and you're counteracting some of the demoralization of poverty, or you can try to have some agency. But obviously the bigger issue is how do we address the larger systemic issue of poverty and other things like that. But I agree with you, and I myself am trying to work, with my colleagues and lab to have a more of a strengths-based approach. So I just came from a conference, and I want to honor the colleague there from an indigenous background who does great work in this area, who is coining the term intergenerational love. That we really need to not just be thinking about intergenerational deficits. And many of these cultures have practices that counteract the negative influences of experiencing poverty. Storytelling, great attachments, that can happen in the context of poverty for sure. Yeah, thanks.
Women from poor economic background who work as a daily wage earners. So even during their last trimesters, they have to go on field and work for 15 to 14 hours, which also add to their mental stress. And often I have seen that they feel guilty that even after delivery, within a day or two, they have to leave the child and go back on the field because they have to earn the money. So this also add to the mental stress, which add to the infant mortality rate, and as we spoke about the prenatal distress. So this, I think, they're the two parameters in poverty.
Absolutely, and we do also have some of that here of people having, working at their Amazon job, where they're physically under a great deal of physical stress, which is, and they need to keep their job and they have to go back right away. We don't have parental leave here, but I very much appreciate the comment. Yeah.
Catherine, thank you so much. This has been terrific.